History Club has been able to meet with another notable speaker on different issues related to history. This past Friday, we were able to speak to professor and author David Detmer. He received his bachelor's degree at Boston University, and then he went on for his master's and doctorate at Northwestern University. He's currently a professor of philosophy in the Department of History and Philosophy at Purdue University. He is the author of several books that include philosophy, U.S. mass media, U.S. foreign policy, and a book analyzing Howard Zinn's critics called Xenophobia. Howard Zinn is a World War II veteran turned pacifist who went on to become a history professor at Boston University, and he went on to write several books, but one called A People's History that focuses on challenging mainstream textbook narratives that might focus maybe too much on people like Columbus or different presidents. His work is different in many ways. One example is that he has a big emphasis on regular people that are fighting and causing societal change. Dr. Detmer talks to us about his book and about the fight over historic narratives in the United States. Here's our talk, and we hope you enjoy it, and be sure to check out Dr. Detmer's work. Dr. Detmer.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good. If you're looking at them looking forward, your face is on a screen, on a bigger screen in front of us. So you want to get started?
Sure. Should I just launch into it?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be able to speak to you. So this is a history club, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So you probably know that history has become very politically controversial in recent years. And just to illustrate that, I'm just going to, I don't know if I should share my screen. Would it be okay for me to share my screen?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Oh no, it says host disabled. So that's okay. It's not that important. I can just describe it. I found just today an article from National Public Radio about new legislation restricting what teachers can discuss. And just to mention a few of these things, it says that since January 2021, there are 35 states that have introduced 137 bills limiting what teachers can teach with regard to race, American history, politics, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And quite a few of these are mainly focused on historical topics. So, for example, in South Carolina, there's a law that's been passed that prohibits teachers from discussing any topic that creates, quote, discomfort, guilt, or anguish. And so, if you're going to talk about things like the history of slavery in America, or the treatment of indigenous people in the past, those sorts of things teachers are sort of afraid to talk about because of all of this sort of legislation. So people are sort of very concerned about what young people are being taught in schools about history. And so how I got into this recently, I wrote a book which came out in 2018, which is about the work of Howard Zinn. So he wrote a book, I'm holding it up here, A People's History of the United States, originally published in 1980, revised many times since then. And how I got into this project is the president of my university. I'm at a branch campus of Purdue University in Indiana. And the president of our university, a man named Mitch Daniels, he's a former governor of the state. And it came out that while he was governor, he had sent an email to some of his subordinates. And it was about that book that I just held up, that book by Howard Zinn. And this is what he said in his email. This terrible anti-American academic has finally passed away. This happened when Zinn died. The obits and commentaries mentioned his book, A People's History of the United States, is the textbook of choice in high schools and colleges around the country. It is a truly execrable anti-factual piece of disinformation that misstates American history on every page. Can someone assure me that it is not in use anywhere in Indiana? If it is, how do we get rid of it before more young people are force-fed a totally false version of our history? So here you have a governor talking about trying to get rid of a book that might be used as a textbook in courses. And so I got interested in that, and I researched it a bit, and I ended up writing a book almost as big as Zinn's book, and this is called Xenophobia, which is a bit of a pun, about people being very kind of afraid and worried about Zinn's book. So basically what Zinn is doing, and I'll just sort of mention this to talk about, the different ways of approaching history. Bear with me a second here. So basically, standard histories before Zinn wrote his book, which came out, as I said, in 1980, they tended to sort of celebrate the great leaders in American history, the presidents, the Supreme Court justices, the military generals, people of that sort. And they had a tendency to sort of downplay the ugly sides of American history. So kind of soft peddling things like slavery, like the treatment of indigenous people, propping up brutal dictators around the world, sabotaging elections overseas, assassinating foreign leaders, all of that kind of stuff would tend to be either omitted or very much downplayed. And so Zinn's book was different in that he did highlight some of that kind of material. And also in his account, sort of the heroes of American history are rarely the leaders that I just mentioned. He thought the more positive things that have happened in American history have tended to be due to popular movements, agitating for peace, racial and sexual equality, improved working conditions, environmental protection, and things of that sort. He also gives a lot of credit to artists of all kinds, writers, poets, filmmakers, painters, people who have sort of helped shape our thinking about these sorts of things. So it's a very different kind of orientation than you would find in most standard history books. So to give you a little bit of the flavor of how it's different, and this sort of shows the different approaches you could take to history, the book begins, this is Zinn's book I'm talking about now, it begins with a chapter on Columbus. Oftentimes the sort of story of American history begins with Columbus, coming to the New World in 1492. And so he quotes from Columbus's journal. And so he speaks, Columbus does, of as his ship was coming ashore, the Arawaks, sort of native people who were greeting him, they ran to greet him. They brought him food and gifts. And then he wrote in his log, I'll quote a little bit of this, they brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. So right off the bat, he's talking about enslaving them. And then it goes on in his journal, just to read one more passage. He says, as soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts. So he's saying, yes, we took them by force. And when he speaks of giving information on whatever there is in these parts, it was mainly gold. He wanted gold. And so he ordered the natives to give him gold, and they were very harshly treated if they did not do so. So the next point I want to make, and this is a point that Zinn makes, is that when you're doing history, you can't avoid being selective. There are so many things that have happened. You can't describe or discuss all of them. You have to sort of focus on what you think is most important or most interesting or most relevant or something like that. And so what Zinn found is in the standard histories, when they talk about Columbus, they usually don't mention much about his treatment of the indigenous people. It's a much more positive treatment. Now, he does mention one prominent historian named Samuel Eliot Morison. And Morison, sort of the leading Columbus scholar, and he wrote a book called Christopher Columbus Mariner. And Zinn points out, to his credit, Morison does not completely ignore this. There's a sentence in there where this is Morison now, who says, the cruel policy initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. So think about that. Genocide is about the harshest word there is in the English language. I mean, genocide refers to the attempt to wipe out an entire group of people, like an entire race or an entire ethnic group. We speak of Hitler's attempt at genocide against the Jews. So here is Morison writing this book about Columbus, and he has that one sentence where he calls what Columbus did cruel and said it resulted in complete genocide. But as Zinn points out, that's just sort of one page in a 500-page sum book, and all the rest of it is positive. So, for example, in the conclusion to the book, Morison had written about Columbus. He had his faults and his defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great: his indomitable will, his superb faith in God and in his own mission as the Christ bearer to lands beyond the seas, his stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to the most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. And so the point that Zinn is making here is that it's not that Morison lied. He didn't do that. And it's not as if he completely omitted, this sort of negative information, but he glossed over it very, very quickly and focused instead on this sort of more positive stuff. And that's kind of what Zinn is saying that the standard history textbooks tend to do. They really sort of play up whatever is positive in American history and either ignore or downplay anything negative. So one more point about this Columbus thing before I move on to something else. Zinn argues, Columbus is long dead. So it's not as if the point is that we have to kind of judge him or anything. It's kind of too late for that. But how this is relevant to the present is that approach to history communicates the message that, murder, slavery, oppression, that's sort of okay if it leads to good results, if it leads to sort of progress and so on. That's sort of the implicit message. And I think that's one reason why there is all of this fighting now, all these states passing laws where you can't say too much about things like slavery or the Jim Crow era of the South, where there was legally enforced racism against blacks. Let's kind of not talk too much about that. Let's talk about what great progress we've made in overcoming it. And so Zinn's argument would be the reason for that is a desire to sort of keep alive the idea that it is okay to outrageously sort of oppress and attack others if we're sort of pursuing our own power and our own interests. I should have said this at the beginning. Let me just say now, I don't mind being interrupted. So at any point, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to I don't know, your faculty advisor there, maybe he can see you raising your hand or what have you. But at the end, we can have questions and discussion. But I also want to say, feel free to interrupt. So let me just ask: are there any questions about anything I've said up to now? Okay, seeing none, I'll ramble. Oh yeah, there is one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just make sure to speak up. One thing that don't say gay bill and be one of those examples that you're talking about, is that part of the same group as not talking about racism in history?
So I'm afraid I didn't quite hear that. Could that be
He asked about would the Don't Say Gay bill qualify under what you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little different in that it doesn't involve, I mean, it doesn't involve quite the same issues, but it's sort of I think what's going on there is um, another motivation behind this legislation is some conservatives, especially, don't want their values challenged as part of the educational system. So if someone is on the religious right, let's say, and they are opposed to homosexuality, then they don't want their kids in school, being taught that one should, respect gays and lesbians and so on. So yeah, I think that, and in fact, that NPR article did mention that a lot of these laws are about gender identity and sexual orientation. So yes, I think that does fit in here. That's a good question.
Anything else?
Okay, if not, it's okay if I ramble on a bit more.
Yeah, and just remember, because we found this out when we were talking to somebody else, probably at 3:19, it will totally just cut you off and hang up.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief, and then we can open it up for more discussion at the end.
And I can let you know with time checks then too.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. All right, so in my book, Xenophobia, so I'll just mention this, maybe this sort of one other thing you might find interesting. So part of what I do is I just talk about the whole censorship angle, Mitch Daniels' effort to ban the teaching of the book in Indiana. But I guess the one thing I haven't talked about that you might find interesting is the following. When Mitch Daniels, when those emails were released, he was a bit embarrassed. Mitch Daniels has typically gotten pretty good press. He seems to be kind of, fairly highly regarded by the press. He usually, is treated very well. This was one of the few times when he mostly took criticism. So, even, newspaper editorial writers and so on who usually support him said, yeah, this is really going too far. A governor shouldn't be meddling in what history textbooks teachers use. And Zinn is sort of a political opponent. Daniels is a fairly conservative Republican. Zinn is more on the left politically. So it's like, here's a history book by someone whose politics I disagree with. I want to ban the teaching of it. That doesn't look good. That's not a good look for Mitch Daniels. So he went on a public relations offensive to try to defend what he was doing. And the biggest thing he did was to say, you don't have to take my word for how bad this Howard Zinn book is. There are lots of prominent historians who will tell you, it's a terrible book. And so I was interested in that. He gave a list of some of these historians and other scholars who had said nasty things about Zinn. And he said, there's even a longer list I can make available on request. So I emailed him and asked for the longer list, and his secretary eventually sent it to me. And so then I went on a research project where I read all of these works that are critical of Zinn, and for that matter, any other ones I could find that were very, very harsh. I didn't address ones that were more nuanced, that people who had some mild disagreements that are normal in scholarship. I was looking at the ones where people said, "Oh, this is a terrible book. This is an awful book." And there are several like that. Now, before I get into my results, I just want to mention Zinn's book has been incredibly successful. It's sold over 3 million copies to date, and that's very rare for a history book. And as of, I don't know if this is still true, but as of just a few years ago, it was true that it sold in each successive year more than it did the year before. So the sales accelerate. So, really a spectacular publishing phenomenon. So a lot of people have found it to be a very worthwhile book. But here's what I found when I did my research, and it is not what I expected. I had read Zinn and thought it was good stuff, so I expected I would disagree with these critics. But I also know that history is difficult, people make mistakes. So I was expecting they were going to score some points. They were going to say, oh, yeah, he got this wrong and he got that wrong, and this argument is no good, and so on. But I found almost none of that. I found maybe 2 or 3 things where I thought the critics had a little bit of a point. But over and over again, what I found is that what they said was not just wrong, but just spectacularly wrong. And the way I have put it in like subsequent writings about this and talks about it, I've said it doesn't reach the standard of like a C- level work for a freshman in college. It's just really, really bad. And so because we're limited in time, I'm just going to give you 2 examples so you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you're interested, I can give you more examples. But let me give you these 2. So one of them, and by the way, most of these people, this is another reason why it's an interesting I called the book xenophobia. It's like there's something psychiatric going on. Most of these people are quite prominent, really well-decorated scholars. So one of them is Sean Wilentz. He's not just a professor of history at Princeton. Princeton's an Ivy League school, a big major one, and he's a full professor. He's not just a full professor. He's the Sidney and Ruth Lapidus professor. So it's like a named thing, which is really prestigious. This is what he said. When Zinn died, the Los Angeles Times wanted to do an article about him. And so they asked some prominent historians to comment. And so this is what Wilentz said. Quote, Zinn had a very simplified view that everyone who was president was always a stinker and every left-winger was always great. That can't be true. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You wouldn't know that from Howard Zinn. So think about what he's claiming there. As I mentioned before, Zinn is much more critical of sort of the standard American heroes than most history textbooks are. So he's saying, yeah, even Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves, that's something good. So Zinn's not going to tell you that. So I want to make sure you get this. This is the exact quote. I won't read the whole thing. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You wouldn't know that from Howard Zinn. What did I do? I opened up A People's History and I went to the chapter on the Civil War. On the very first page, which is page 171, I found the following statement, quote, it was Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves. I think you'll agree with me. I'll bet you I said freshman in college. I'll bet you guys in your class, if you wrote a paper where you tried to refute someone by saying he wouldn't even admit X, and then you open up and you find he says X right where you'd expect it. I mean, that's pretty bad scholarship. So that's an example. So here's another one. I mentioned, this is the other one I'll mention, and then I'll stop and give you guys a chance to talk and ask questions. So since Zinn was on the left politically, a good way to smear someone on the left is to accuse them of being like soft on the Soviet Union back in the Cold War days, because Zinn was writing in 1980, which was during the
Are you still there, Dr. Detmer? Can you go back like 10 seconds? Just did this last time too. I don't know. Our internet connection just like lagged out. Can you go back just a little bit? We lost.
Yes. So, okay. So did I finish my point about Sean Wilentz and Abraham Lincoln? Did I finish that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll pick it up right there then. So the next one, I was saying that since Zinn was on the left politically, a good way to sort of smear someone like that during the Cold War era is to accuse them of being soft on the Soviet Union, sort of America's big enemy during the Cold War era. And so David Greenberg, a professor of history at Rutgers University, that's what he did in something he wrote on Zinn. And he wrote the following, quote, Zinn relentlessly criticized American policy and seems to have stayed silent about the Soviet Union. So when I read that, I immediately focused on the phrase seemed to stay silent. And I thought, that's kind of bad scholarship. You shouldn't be writing that someone seemed to stay silent. You should look at their works and see what they said on it. And so it turns out that Zinn said things like the following about the Soviet Union. This is a quotation from one of Zinn's writings. The Soviet Union has been brutal in its treatment of its own citizens, murdering peasants in large numbers during the process of collectivization, imprisoning, torturing, and executing those it considered dissidents, whether ordinary people, intellectuals, artists, or distinguished leaders of the 1917 revolution. The term police state fits it very well. In my book, I provide a number of other quotations from Zinn's work in which he uses the following words in describing the Soviet Union: ruthless, oppressive, brutal, murderous, a dictatorship, a police state, an example of fascism. And he criticizes its, quote, aggression, its atrocities, and its monstrous tyranny. And all of these things are said multiple times and said in works right where you would expect them. Like one of them is in an article called Communism and Anti-Communism. And others of these quotes are in the book of People's History, which is the one Greenberg is supposedly talking about. So again, this would be bad for a college freshman. It would be bad for a high school student. I mean, think about if in one of your papers you said, oh, here's this guy who says nothing bad about the Soviet Union, and then in 10 seconds, I can find a whole bunch of statements where he calls the Soviet Union murders. So these are tenured professors at major universities who commit these scholarly atrocities. And so I think, this just shows how high the stakes are in these battles over history, that, they're able to get away with this sort of stuff. I mean, to some extent, they get away with it. So someone like me comes along and writes a book and points it out. And so the people who read my book, know about it. But by and large, they're able to get away with this kind of stuff. So history is this huge battleground. People really fight over it, and they often really don't fight fair. So I think, so that we'll have enough time, I'd like to stop there and invite your questions or your comments on any of this or anything else about American history you'd like to discuss.
We have about 12 minutes.
So I wrote an essay on the Betsy Ross myth and whether she sewed the U.S. flag or not. And I found she actually didn't, but there is really no concrete evidence that we know of anyone who did. We technically don't know. What were your thoughts on that? Like, do you believe the myth? Like, why do you believe we mythologize a lot of our history?
Yeah, that's excellent. I've never researched the whole Betsy Ross thing, so I have no expertise on that in particular. But myths and oversimplifications happen all the time. I don't know why that would be the case here, but oftentimes the real truth of history is complicated and many-sided, and there's sort of a good story that gets started, and that's sort of what sticks. But one other comment I would make, this isn't directly responsive to your question, but I thought of it I'm sort of inspired by your question to make this comment. That one thing that I think really makes history interesting is what I call the forensic aspect of it. In other words, the past is gone. What we have is just the present. We have like records and stuff of the past. And so with history, you have to try to reconstruct it from present evidence. And I assume you are correct in what you say about Betsy Ross and the flag. I take it you're saying the current evidence just really doesn't establish, who did first sew that flag or how it got started. Did I hear you right? Is that what you're saying? You find that that there's sort of not compelling evidence as to how exactly it happened. Did I get that right?
That's correct. There is really no hardcore evidence. Like all the records are kind of lost in time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for that. I didn't know that.
Yes. If they don't have any questions, I got some for you, Dr. Detmer.
That's just fine. Thank you.
Maybe something will pop up. You talked about some different topics that we fight about. I was wondering what you think is one of the most contentious topics that we argue about, like today in U.S. history.
Well, so yeah, that's a good question. I think slavery is certainly one. Some of you may know the New York Times a few years ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was fairly recently, they came out with something called the 1619 Project. And so that was arguing that, so 1619 was the year slaves were imported into America from Africa. And so it was arguing that that really was a hugely consequential event in American history, that just like a whole lot of our history really can't be understood without that. And so many people have been highly offended by that, have said, oh, yes, slavery happened and it was bad. That's a stain on our history. But, we ended slavery with the Civil War. We haven't had it in a long time. And, and they try to sort of downplay it. Whereas the 1619 Project was really saying, that was something that really had a huge role in a whole lot of how American history has unfolded since then, and continues to have huge effects today. So it's not just a relic of the past. It was such an important thing, and it had such far-reaching consequences that we still have it. We still are experiencing those consequences today. So, for example, people of African descent, I don't have the figures in front of me, but they are on average, considerably poorer than people of European descent. And so one possible explanation for that is the whole issue of inheritance. People who have never been part of being slaves, they've always been able to pass on their death, pass on whatever wealth they have to the next generation. And a very large percentage of the American economy is inherited wealth. There's a French economist named Thomas Piketty who estimates it's 40%, like 40% of the wealth in our country is inherited. Well, people of African descent are at a huge disadvantage there, because for many, many generations, their ancestors were slaves and weren't earning any money that they could pass on. So that would sort of be an example. So some people want to deny that slavery has had this kind of lingering effect. So if I haven't really sort of thought through what would be the number one thing, but I think that's near the top, in part because of the 1619 Project being such a recent development.
So speaking of 1619 Project, when you kind of did the debunk on all the critics for Howard Zinn, are you interested in updating that for like the 1776 Commission and Mary Grabar's? I know you have a section about her.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was updated with her book, Debunking Zinn, but I started reading it. I have a PDF of it, but it didn't really seem like it has anything in there actually debunking them at all.
Yeah. So I didn't read that all the way through. I sort of glanced through it, and I'm going to admit something to you. I was kind of curious what she was going to say about my work, since her book came out about a year after mine. And she does have a couple of references to my work, but they're both completely innocuous. They're not substantive. It's like she got one factoid from me, and then like she mentioned me as a Howard Zinn fan who had written a book on Howard Zinn. And so she didn't respond to any of the criticisms I made of her in her book. And she continued to support some of the things that I debunked in my book without addressing, the criticisms I had made. So, when I'm teaching my students, I always say you need to pick up the argument where it is. So, if somebody says X and then somebody else refutes it, then if you want to defend X, you need to sort of take on the argument against it. So that was sort of the big problem I had with her book. Not that I sort of went through her claims to look into them. So I'll leave it at that.
So you said early on in the video that there might have been 2 or 3 like maybe claims that were legitimate in Howard Zinn.
Yes.
What were those?
The worst one, the biggest and clearest error I found, and I'm just looking through to see if I can get this right. It had to do with the death toll at the bombing of Dresden in World War II. where Zinn had put the death toll at over 100,000, when more recent studies have yielded a consensus that it's probably closer to 25,000. So he was off by a good bit. But a point that I've made and stuff I've written about this subsequent to my book is the very few errors like that I found in Zinn, at least there's a kind of plausible explanation as to how it might have happened. And it turns out earlier scholarship, there were lots of scholars, if you go back a few decades, who did put it at over 100,000. So my guess is Zinn had not familiarized himself with the more recent scholarship. Maybe no one called it to his attention. As the book went through various updates, he did correct a few errors. So maybe that one was never called to his attention. At least there's a plausible story. Whereas if you go back to Sean Willett saying Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, you'd never learn that from Howard Zinn. I can't even figure out how it's possible to make a mistake like that. Any decent human being, if you're going to criticize someone after they've died and you're going to make a charge like that, you'd at least check to make sure that you got it right. And he didn't. But at any rate, back to your question, that was the biggest one I found. There were like 2 or 3 others where it depended on interpretation, where Zinn said something where if you interpret it one way, what he's saying is right, but if you interpret it another way, it's wrong. So it's like there was one clear error, 2 or 3 where it depended on interpretation, and like 80 where the critics were just clearly, demonstrably wrong. It was just an amazing thing that I found.
We have about 3.5 minutes left. Here's kind of a two-parter.
Sure.
Message or advice to young history students, and do you have any helpful resources like I don't know, something we're talking next week to Brown University's Cost of War. They kind of look at like the economic impacts of the war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Wow. Yeah.
Are there any like resources that you have for us?
Oh, that's such a good question. I guess one thing I would say is I'm interested in human rights issues. So reading things like Amnesty International reports, or for stuff in the Americas, there's an organization called America's Watch. They put out reports on human rights violations. And I think the reason sources like that are important, the International Council of Jurists is another one. The International Red Cross is another one. The reason things like that are important is our media, they tend to get their information just from American sources, and American sources tend not to point out human rights violations by American allies. I mean, things like Saudi Arabia beheading people for the crime of sorcery. You tend not to read about that in the New York Times. But you can read about it in these human rights reports. So that's the one I can think of off the top of my head as a resource. And then as for advice to young historians, be brave, be bold. Don't feel that you have to just write history the same way everybody else does. Feel free to try to do something different. Feel free to look into topics that are maybe under reported on, if they things that are important that you don't find in the common surveys. I think those are things worth doing.
All right, well, I want to thank you. We do have a minute, but I think that was literally the perfect way to end it. It was nice, it was heartfelt, and definitely useful. So I appreciate your time, Dr. Detmer.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I think it's great that you're doing this kind of stuff. I wish there was stuff like this when I was in high school. So I want to commend you guys for participating in stuff like this.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a good group. Again, we usually do have like 18 devoted members, but they're super involved kids. They're involved in like every club, every sport. So we have some good ones, but some of them couldn't make it today.
No, I understand. Well, hopefully they'll get something out of the video of it.
I know at least 2 of them will watch it. Two of them want to study history, and they're fascinated. But one has basketball, one is swimming.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Detmer.
You're very welcome.
See ya.
Bye.